California, 1992. It was a year that held so much promise for a vibrant young woman, a year that should have been filled with laughter, dreams, and a bright future. Instead, it became the year her life was brutally stolen. Her story cut short in the silent shadows of a forgotten utility corridor, hidden from plain sight, tucked away between humming power lines and decaying concrete infrastructure. A killer chose this desolate, lonely spot to commit an unspeakable act. She was found strangled, abandoned, left to become another tragic statistic in a wave of violence that would go on to haunt investigators for decades. For the detectives who first arrived on the scene, the signature of this crime was chillingly clear. The method, the specific location, the brutal, cold efficiency. This wasn't the work of an amateur. One of the lead detectives later recalled, "We knew right away this was bad. The way she was found, it had all the hallmarks of someone who'd done this before, or would do it again." Evidence was meticulously collected. Every fiber, every trace, every potential clue was bagged and tagged. Crucially, DNA samples were preserved. But back in 1992, the technology to identify a suspect from genetic material was still in its infancy. It was a groundbreaking science, but it couldn't yet provide the answers they so desperately needed. So, the samples were carefully catalogued, stored away in a climate-controlled facility, and filed away a biological time capsule waiting for science to catch up to the killer's cruelty. As the months bled into years, a terrifying and unmistakable pattern began to emerge. 3 other women in different parts of California were found murdered under chillingly similar circumstances. Isolated, out-of-the-way locations, strangulation, all the crimes bore the same dreadful mark of the same predator. The investigators knew they were hunting a serial killer. "We tried everything," another investigator on the task force remembered. "We chased down every lead, interviewed countless potential witnesses. We even consulted with psychological profilers and psychics. Nothing broke. It was like we were chasing a ghost. This guy just vanished after each crime, leaving nothing behind but devastation." By the late 1990s, with no new leads and no new crimes fitting the pattern, the cases officially went cold. 4 families were left shattered, trapped in a limbo of unanswered questions. 4 communities lived with the lingering fear of a monster who had seemingly just disappeared. One victim's sister shared her family's pain years later. 33 years. That's how long we waited. Every birthday, every holiday, there was this ... absence. This hole in our family that could never be filled. We never ever stopped believing that someone would pay for what they did. But as the years went by, hope became so much harder to hold on to. For families like hers, life became suspended between grief and an agonizing uncertainty. They couldn't truly move forward, yet they could never let go. They were frozen in time, just like the case files gathering dust on a shelf. But while these families waited and grieved, science wasn't standing still. It was racing forward. The DNA technology that was so primitive in the 1990s was undergoing a quiet revolution. A forensic scientist explained the shift. By the 2010s, we had access to forensic tools that were simply unimaginable 30 years earlier. We're talking about familial DNA searching, genetic genealogy databases, and something called SNP analysis. We could now find suspects not just through their own DNA, but through the DNA of their relatives, even distant cousins, who desubmitted a sample to an ancestry website for fun. This incredible breakthrough changed everything. Cases that had been locked in cold storage for decades, deemed unsolvable, were suddenly being cracked wide open, one after another. And so, in January of 2025, investigators decided it was time to revisit the long-forgotten utility corridor murder. It was time to wake the case up. We submitted the original DNA sample from the 1992 crime scene to a specialized genetic genealogy lab. The lead cold case detective explained. Within just a few weeks, they called us back. They had built a family tree, and at the end of one of its branches was our suspect. But the discovery was even bigger than they'd hoped. The DNA from that utility corridor didn't just match one crime scene, it matched all four. After 33 long years, the invisible thread connecting these four brutal murders finally had a name and a face attached to it. The ghost was about to become very, very real. What's truly remarkable, the detective continued, is that this individual had no prior felony record that would ever flagged him in a traditional law enforcement database. He was hiding in plain sight. A neighbor, a co-worker, just a normal guy. But his family's DNA told the story he thought he'd buried forever. January 2025. A quiet suburban street, just like any other in America. Behind one of these ordinary doors lived a man who had carried an extraordinarily dark secret for over 3 decades. The moment we knocked on that door, an officer on the arrest team said we knew his world was about to collapse. 33 years of thinking, he got away with it, all ending in an instant with a knock on the door. During questioning, the pieces of the puzzle finally fell into place. This was no random, opportunistic offender. He was methodical, calculated. A predator who had spent decades living a chilling double life, walking among his neighbors, his secret locked away. He thought he was smarter than everyone, the interrogator noted. He truly believed he'd covered all his tracks and that the past was dead and buried. But biology doesn't lie. Your DNA is your unique signature, and his was written all over those crime scenes. The arrest didn't just solve one murder. It connected 4 separate, decades-old investigations across the state of California, finally bringing a measure of closure to multiple families who had waited and wondered for a lifetime. When the news reached the victims' families, it was a tidal wave of emotion. When they told us they'd arrested someone, "I couldn't breathe," said the victim's sister. 33 years of wondering, of imagining, and suddenly we finally knew, it doesn't bring her back. Nothing ever will. but knowing that he can't hurt anyone else, that he'll finally pay for what he did. It's something. It has to be enough. This case stands as a powerful testament to the incredible power of persistence and the relentless march of scientific progress. What was utterly impossible for law enforcement in 1992 became a reality in 2025. It sends a clear message. No crime, no matter how old, is truly unsolvable anymore. As one detective put it, we're living in a new era. Cold cases aren't really cold anymore. They're just dormant. They're waiting. And with every single advancement in technology, we're waking them up, one by one. This case is a stark reminder of why we do this work. It's for the victims. It's for their families. Justice might be delayed, but it does not have an expiration date. In January 2025, the suspect was charged with 4 counts of first-degree murder. He remains in custody, awaiting trial. For the families of his victims, a 33-year nightmare has finally come to an end. And for that one young woman whose life was so cruelly stolen in a lonely utility corridor back in 1992, justice has finally arrived. Her memory lives on, no longer defined by the darkness of how she died, but celebrated for the light she brought into the world and how she lived. If you have any information about unsolved crimes, no matter how insignificant you think it might be, please contact your local law enforcement or submit an anonymous tip online. Science has given a voice back to the victims. Now it's our turn to listen. Thank you so much for watching. If you found this story compelling, please consider liking this video and subscribing to the channel for more deep dives into cases where justice against all odds prevails. We'll see you next time.